staff?
We'd like to have Chris Stevens and, I guess I will let him introduce Jim Andrew.
Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, sir. First, a bit of a procedural request. As you know, you're permitted to take items on your agenda out of order if you so desire, and my request to you is to do that in this case and to use the allotted time that I usually have for the legal update to discuss some issues that are relevant to the Delta Plan discussion that we'll have later on in the day. In this case, the discussion will be a short, maybe 15-minute briefing on EIR issues. Board members had asked last time about what we have learned to date on the EIR process. As you know, the public comment period closed only in February, and we're still in March. So what I'd like to do is ask our CEQA legal team and consultant team heads to come up and give us a quick update.
If you would, please. Mr. Andrew and
Jim and Gwen. And I'd also like to refer you, assuming that this is okay with the council, to
any objection to taking this up? I also understand that both of you have schedule conflicts, which make it impossible. So we would be ignorant if we delayed it because you couldn't be here later in the afternoon. But putting that very practical problem aside, there's no objection. So please proceed.
Okay, good. And again, I think that this is one of the three major areas that we had, at least as staff, suggested could be informative for the council's purposes. Right. To give back direction to staff to produce a final staff draft. As you know, we're still in the midst of this legal process. Some of the big major Delta Plan EIR comment themes are listed on page 3 of the staff report for agenda item 9A. So perhaps if you could turn to that.
9A, page 3, it's the attachment 9A, which is a staff memo of 4 pages in length. Is that correct? Right.
Yes, and it's the third page at the bottom of the page.
Okay, major Delta Plan environmental impact comments.
So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jim Andrew, our technical advisor from the Attorney General's office.
Hi there. Good morning. It's been a while since we've had an EIR discussion. So what I wanted to do at the outset is remind the council and the onlookers where we are in the process, the CEQA process as compared to the Delta Plan. And I think it's also important at the very outset here to reiterate what the CEQA process is intended to do.
Get a little closer to the mic.
What the CEQA process is intended to do and why CEQA exists, because I think it's important to distinguish what the EIR's purpose is vis-a-vis why CEQA exists, as distinguished from other sources of information that are very important to the council in developing the Delta Plan. CEQA exists, and its federal counterpart, which was implemented about a year before CEQA in the late 60s and right around 1970, exists to prevent bad things like burning rivers from happening, which used to happen. There were, a series of environmental disasters that happened, and it said, wait a minute, before the government is going to do things, either on its own through projects that it sponsors itself or through granting approvals to private entities to do things, before the government takes that step, it needs to stop and think, oh, wait a minute, what can we do to make sure that this action, this permit, this new project, this infrastructure project is done in a way that minimizes harm to the environment. And I think it's really important to understand that CEQA is intended to prevent adverse environmental consequences, and that's actually the terminology that CEQA uses for significant environmental effects. It's adverse environmental consequences. So what it does is it takes a project or a policy program that has been formulated largely already based on other desires, either a private entity's desire to build a new shopping mall, or a government agency's desire to build a new freeway, or a government agency's desire to build a new city hall. That's informed by policy reasons. We need a new city hall. Our old one's falling apart. We need a new freeway here. We need a new high-speed rail system, to one that I'm working on. That's driven by other reasons. And with a project like the Delta Plan, which is a bit unique from a in terms of how it fits in with CEQA's purposes, because it has an environmental benefit intent inherent as part of it. But CEQA is designed to prevent bad things from happening. It is not designed as a primary informational tool to guide the foundational aspects of a plan or policy that's being put together from a scientific and environmental analysis perspective. That's why you have the Independent Science Board, a very qualified staff to do that. It's a very different lens. CEQA says, we want to make sure you don't do bad stuff. And if something bad's going to happen, we want to make sure that we attach mitigation measures to your final approval to prevent anything bad from happening as best as we can. It is not set up with a framework of how can we devise the best policy tool to fix environmental problems. That's not the way that the whole structure of it, both the way the substance is done, because it focuses only on significant adverse environmental effects. Largely beneficial things are somewhat beneficial effects receive very little attention in CEQA. There's a role for them, but that's not what it's designed to do. It is designed to analyze a largely formulated and static physical project design or program plan formulation, and then say, okay, before you cross the final step and adopt that and give your blessing, what can we do to make sure that bad things don't happen? And that's why the CEQA process is set up such that you have a project description, which is the government agency's formulation of what it wants to do, informed by all sorts of other sources. And then it says, okay, let's look at that static, desired project and figure out if it's going to do anything bad, and then make sure we make some minor adjustments to it, plus impose a whole series of robust mitigation measures to prevent the bad outcomes. And I say that, and I beg your indulgence in that sort of lengthy discussion, because it is really a completely different mindset than a primary informational source like your Independent Science Board and all these other reports that you are given, which are incredibly valuable in your staff. It's not for that purpose, which is, again, why CEQA is designed to look at an already largely formulated, but still draft, but largely baked plan, get public comment on it, then make some minor changes as appropriate, maybe coming from some of the alternatives that were looked at, but mostly it's in the mitigation measures to make sure that, okay, at the end of the day, we get this long list of mitigation measures to ensure that what the policy direction is implemented in a way that is the least environmentally damaging. So, which means that where you are in the process, you already had a fifth staff draft, which was a complete draft, and you're in the process now of making some adjustments to it. But where the rubber will meet the road from a CEQA perspective is at the final adoption stage, where, and I'll get into this in a minute, where we're going to have this very, very lengthy, robust set of mitigation measures that will be required for all covered actions, and that will be desired for all projects that may result from your recommendations, but that are not covered actions because you won't have authority to implement those. And I'll discuss that in a minute. But that's really where the CEQA rubber meets the road, which is different than other reports you're getting that drive the primary formulation of your Delta plan. So I'm happy to pause there and take any thoughts, or we can move into some of the themes and I have some thoughts on
I
those
raised
as
this
well.
question. I think Ms. Marcus has also repeatedly talked about the roles the EIR plays in this and what we can learn from the information provided. I mean, I could be wrong. I've read some, but not all of the 5,200 pages. But the ones I read repeated in substantial part comments that have been received on the Delta plan for many of the items. But I don't know how many of the items are. Is there? I know that a couple weeks ago, or maybe last month, you said there were 3 things that had caught your attention. We had a staff memo outlining the 3 things. I must confess I've forgotten what they precisely are, but that you did think ought to be adjusted in the Delta plan to reflect the comments. Refresh my memory on those 3 items.
Yeah, and it was 3 items. One of the items was somewhat overlapping with something the staff was already thinking about, so it actually got folded into one of staff's presentations.
And the subject is? Or was?
I can't remember that one, but I can remember the other two that are independent from what staff had already come up with that were in the presentation last time. And I may lean on Gwen's memory here a little bit, but I believe one of them was a heightened emphasis on recycled water, because if folks who are using Delta water, rather than developing their own local storage projects, desal projects, can just expand existing wastewater treatment plants to turn them into tertiary plants so that you actually generate some water that can be reused. That results, generally speaking, in lower environmental impacts because it's a little less impactful to retrofit an existing wastewater treatment plant than it would be to build a brand new desal plant on the coast. And if you can get to the same end. So that was a good idea that came from Alternative 2, I believe. So that was one item that...
And the suggestion was, and the staff is going to revise the text. I can't remember if you were doing other things in that regard. We can talk about it later. So, okay, so we've got the recycle. There was the third one, Gwen, do you remember that? And the reason I'm trying to do it is...
water transfers.
Water transfers, yeah.
Which was that, if water transfers that still comply with the state board rules for protection of the environment, if some administrative burdens can be lessened or removed, so to permit water transfers that still comply with state board rules and otherwise, are still beneficial for the ecosystem, that a recommendation to try and develop a working group to figure out a way to remove administrative burdens to make water transfers easier. So those were two items that came out of our analysis of the alternatives that were suggested. That said, those are good ideas to improve the Delta plan.
Well, here's the thing that I'm interested in. I think Gwen had prepared, or maybe the two of you had prepared, almost within a week after the filing close of comments on the environmental impact report, just the summary. We've received roughly so many pages of comments from roughly 100 and 200, whatever it is, groups and organizations, and 10 of the organizations constitute 80% of the comments, or 90, or whatever the dickens it was. And that at least was useful, and then there was a list of the groups, organizations, or individuals who commented, and you had a estimation of the number of pages they had submitted, and a couple of references at least that a number of them had incorporated by reference documents of some length that they previously submitted to the council, all of which was helpful. I'm interested in that kind of structural review as you determine it. So I don't want to lose the three ideas that came up last time, nor do I want to lose what we're talking about here. I'm not asking for you prematurely to bring in all the answers you're writing to all the comments. That is, I understand, the last thing that happens. I am, however, interested in getting a flavor of, 75 comments appear to address the same issue. I understand you'll answer it later, but until you get some understanding about that, it just seems to me it's like a process that's floating on out there. And what I do not wish to receive is 1,500 pages of answers to undigested, unsummarized comments. I need something with some order to it. And because I'm not asking you to produce the answers to the responses you're going to make, is there a way to develop that so on a periodic basis we can find out as you go through this stuff just structures? I read the memo and there are 8 or 9 or 10 bullet points, and maybe those are consolidated comments, but also as you find issues that have been previously submitted and dealt with in the Delta plan. For example, documents were incorporated from many of the groups that repeated the admonition, we should be excluded from the Delta plan, whether they're upstream, in Delta, downstream. The Aqua position that everything should be voluntary, nothing should be mandatory, we should have a lot more coordination and consult. I just want to know if those are there. That's fine, you'll answer them. I can't figure out the process yet without something that tries to structure it.
Okay. Just to reiterate, for the benefit of the chair and the other members, just where we're at in the process and what the process actually is, because we've touched upon the fact a couple times that ultimately, we're going to come back to you with what's called a final EIR and ask that you certify it. And you've asked us along the way, hey, we don't want to be giving direction on a final staff draft until you give us your impressions of what the draft EIR says. Tell us what you think. Obviously, we understand that these aren't the final responses, official responses to comments, but give us a sense. Don't leave us in the dark. And I think that that's what we're trying to do. But I think it's very important, Jim perhaps can reiterate, that we are still in the middle of the legal process and that there is, again, the comment period closed in February. Tell us again how many comment letters, how many comments in those letters, where you're at in compiling them, and what the process is for getting us to a final EIR. And then your ideas, as the chair has asked for, giving an impression of major thematics that are going to inform the council, because it's now being asked by staff to give direction on what we're hoping is going to be a near final staff draft here shortly. So it's kind of a balancing act, but it's important to reiterate we're still in the middle of a legal process with regard to CEQA.
Yeah, that's important to understand. It's also important to understand that we're not, Gwen and I and others who are working on the EIR are not, sitting in a vacuum somewhere completely disconnected from the staff that is actually advising you on the Delta plan. So as stuff comes up, as we go through the, 1.5 feet of pages of comments, and that's not including the 3 feet of old documents that were submitted as well.
Can I just ask you a question? Is that a rough calculation?
About a foot and a quarter.
New comments.
Foot and a quarter of new, and then probably another 1.5 feet of old reports.
Incorporated old documents. Fine, that tells me something. That's useful to know.
And if I may add, a portion of that 1.5 feet is also previously submitted comments on the Delta plan.
Yeah, that would be my expectation.
Right.
Yeah. Randy.
Let me try and simplify the thrust of Phil's question. We were told at the beginning of the EIR process that this would inform the council unto the 6th draft. Tell us how that's going to happen if we're not going to get a summary until the end of the process.
Well, I think it already has informed. I mean, we've come up with the three items, one of which the council our staff was already thinking about, and the 2 other items from the analysis of the alternatives. So that is how part of the information has been happening. And we're digesting the foot or so of comments, organizing them. The themes that are on this page 3 and 4 of attachment 9A are an aggregation of what we call master responses. So let me give a preview of sort of what the final EIR will look like. We got numerous comments that are of the same general theme, same general nature. The way final EIRs are done in responses to comments is for projects where there are lots of comments along the same lines, you group all of those comments and answer them via a lengthy, thoughtful master response narrative that will dispose, I think, in this case, of probably 50% of the comments, more than 50% of the comments. And the themes that I was about to go through are that 50 to 75% of the major comments that we got on the Delta plan, on the Delta plan EIR. And because of the nature of the Delta plan, and I'll get into this also in a minute, unlike a massive infrastructure project where there are 1,000 different technical issues that people can raise, the Delta plan deals with some high-level issues. The EIR doesn't get into detailed quantitative items that lend themselves to precise comment. So it's because of the nature of the Delta plan itself, master responses are a really good tool to deal with the majority of the comments that we receive because the majority of the comments deal with similar themes. So that will be part of the final EIR that we release. And again, and I think it will be, as I go through some of the major themes, I think it'll be more evident that the major value that comes out of the EIR, part of it we've already delivered, and then the major value comes out through the mitigation measures at the end of the day that get imposed on all covered actions.
Don?
Yeah. James, just a question then about the processing, kind of the parallel or in sync processes here. So then is it the plan that the time we have for council consideration, what's now termed the seventh draft, supposedly final plan for consideration for council adoption. At the same time, we would have the environmental document before us for certification, one and the same?
I mean, exactly how the final hearings will be structured, I don't think we've sorted it.
But we have to take action on the environmental document before you can act on the
Correct.
plan.
Yes,
so,
correct.
So that they would, okay, that would be before us.
Right.
And then I know there's been discussion about, again, it hasn't been determined yet, about depending upon the nature and what's reflected in the final draft about recirculation. Are you going to talk about that as to, or you'll bring that forward once you've made changes? And again, I know we've had some information provided on that, but I'm curious as to what juncture then leading up to the seventh draft and some final document for certification, when is it that the determination as to whether there's a need and whether we do that or not? When would that come before the council?
After we see the sixth staff draft,
okay,
which I guess will be towards the end of April. It'll be at that point that we will make a,
So you'll make that call then from a staff perspective. Obviously, it still requires this council to act to do that. But
my assumption is we'll come with the sixth staff draft to the council, make sure that that's close to what you want, make those changes, and at that point tell you if we believe that it would require a recirculation. It's probably in May that decision gets made at the May meeting, and then go from there.
Okay, that's my question. Thanks.
Okay. Jim, why don't you go through these categories, which you think will be helpful, and then let's talk about those.
Okay, sure. So if you turn to the bottom of page 3 on agenda item 9A, and I'll go through these mostly one by one, but at the outset here I'm going to group the first two and then the fourth from the bottom on page 4. They're related. The first two are the EIR analysis was too qualitative, more quantitative analysis is requested, or commenters requested more quantitative analysis. The level of detail of the EIR was not specific enough. And then the fourth one from the bottom is that the EIR analysis was confusing in light of the imprecise and broad coverage of the proposed Delta plan and the Council's limited direct approval authority over projects that come, after the Delta plan.
I think these categories are interesting, but to me, I think your biggest hurdle to face in explaining it to us, let alone the public, is to deal with the fact that most of those whose comments I read talk about this as if it were a traditional project environmental impact report, not a programmatic environmental impact report. Now, I blame your profession and my profession, the legal profession, for writing laws that say there's a separate type of environmental impact report, but using the same word, project, in both. And the lack of clarity and ease of understanding of the differences between the two leads people to view, well, every issue I raise has to be answered completely inadequately because that's the way the game's play. I just think the biggest problem is the distinction between those types of environmental impact reports. And from a clear and simply stated difference flows a structure and summarization of comments that are more adequately answered. It's a very difficult thing.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into exactly what I was going to start to explain and read from CEQA. I also think that it's in my experience, irrespective of that confusion and our profession, who have come up with a law that is inherently quite messy. In fact, I'll give you a quickie statistic. Of all the reported decisions on CEQA in California, I think there's over 400. I think if in cases of over the 400, I think the government lost about 50% of those cases. So that means that it's either a tough law or a very poorly crafted one where government agencies trying to do their best can't support an EIR as being compliant with the law.
There is another option there, which is they did a crappy job of doing the EIR, which I've seen a lot of.
Yeah, that's there are many.
Just to be fair.
There are many explanations. It's also true that under a CEQA case, you have to run the table. If you lose one single item out of a laundry list of 100 that can be thrown at you, you have to run the table. Otherwise, you lose. So, yes, we are to blame. The lawyers who drafted this thing. I also think, in my experience, that stakeholders and justifiably want answers, and they don't like to wait, and that's inherent. That's normal, and want to look down the road and want more detail, and being told, well, we don't quite know yet, that'll come later, isn't very satisfying, even if it's the truth, and that's what the truth is here. Particularly unlike CalFed, where there was a list of precise projects that was being evaluated, this council in the Delta Plan is not proposing any particular project. It's not mandating any particular projects, and so our ability to predict and say, yes, it's going to be this precise thing, we can do a quantitative analysis, we can't do it. And that's not very satisfying, but it kind of is what it is. But that will come later, and I guess that's where I'll start, which is that the EIR's level of specificity is inherently tied to the level of specificity of the action being contemplated, and CEQA was very clear on that point. It says, under degree of specificity, it says the degree of specificity required in an EIR will correspond to the degree of specificity involved in the underlying activity which is described in the EIR. CEQA contemplates that. It says, for example, an EIR on a construction project will necessarily be more detailed in the specific effects of the project than will be an EIR on the adoption of a local general plan or comprehensive zoning ordinance, because the effects of the construction can be predicted with greater accuracy. It's exactly which the chair mentioned. It's not satisfying to people who are looking for answers. We'll get into one of the comments, which was we want more detail about VDCP. Well, there's lots of reasons I'll get into in a minute why we didn't and couldn't do that. But people wanted to know as much as they could right now and not wait for the DWR process to go. They wanted to know that, and that's where a lot of the comments came in. But it's not where we are in this process. So, and I'll read one more thing. It says, an EIR on a project such as adoption of a general plan should focus on the secondary effects that can be expected to follow from the adoption, but that EIR need not be as detailed as an EIR on the specific construction projects that might follow. Again, it's like what I just said, and it's in CEQA. And as the chair also noted, CEQA also says you're not supposed to speculate on that. We did the best we could, and I think we even went a little beyond where CEQA, really requires us to go in terms of looking down the road at potential projects that may come. We looked at a series of analogous projects. We had to come up with that way to provide some meat on the bones, and I think we did a good job in doing that to try and provide as much as we could. And as the chair noted, this is a first tier EIR, and CEQA as a program level EIR. CEQA defines tiering as a coverage of general matters and environmental effects prepared for a policy, plan, or program, followed by narrower or more site-specific environmental documents. And that's what's going to happen here. Every agency that does a project that you either that will be a covered action or that you are recommending they do will have to cover that through CEQA. And I'm guessing in most cases it'll be an EIR, and that'll be project-specific. When those covered actions come before you, they'll have to come with the EIR that was done by the local agency, and that will be where the precise analysis is done.
So, Jim, did you get a sense in grouping those three or four what the level of priority or prominence was as opposed to all the comments? Was this like the major grouping of comment themes?
This is the major grouping of comment themes that I can say.
So the master responses that you'll see in the final EIR we're still evolving, and those always evolve as you go through the comments and you read categories and you add a couple as you read more comments. But this is going to be close to what you'll see in the master response groupings.
Gloria.
I want to focus on the themes, and I think Chris asked about the list of the red or the blue button. Which one?
Just pull it.
Okay. You have a number of themes or comments that were made, and I think the first two or three are very significant. First, is there any priority in terms of the themes that you've listed?
Gwen, maybe you can comment on which ones sort of had the high number of comments and which ones had the. I mean, these are all ones that got fair prominent number,
Right,
and amongst these.
Right.
Yeah, these are the tired ones, and I may want to add too that not every letter would certainly respond to these, would include all of these comments, and so we would see groupings of interests and stakeholders or agencies depending on where their geography is, and they would be similar in nature there. But it's not that every letter we received had all of these items in it, and this group here, all of these represent in the order of 5 to 10% of the comments that we received on the EIR. We did receive a lot more other comments, and I'll be quite honest on, people will respond and say you needed to rewrite this sentence this way versus that way, but it didn't change. It wasn't part of these themes. It was personal, or we had typos.
So I'm
shocked.
So there are not any order in terms of importance or the number of
these more look
reactions.
like order, just sort of from more general to specifics.
Now, based on these themes, I know that the council can make a decision in May about whether we recirculate the EIR. But just looking at these themes, do you think that it's a good chance that we would recirculate it based on some of these key issues here?
CEQA's standard for recirculation is fairly precise, and it favors, being that the draft EIR is the major document, and recirculation is required when the public has been deprived of a meaningful opportunity to comment on a significant adverse environmental effect of the project. And so CEQA sets up a few examples where it says if there's a newly identified significant impact that was not identified at the draft EIR stage, some new impact, or we forgot something, or some comments you get says, oh, this is a new potentially bad thing that may happen from this project that that your EIR drafters goofed. We, the public, need an opportunity to comment on that. That's what triggers recirculation. So it's a fairly narrow standard, which is if there's a new bad thing that could happen that you didn't identify for the public, we, the public, get an opportunity to comment on that.
But one of your themes says that the EIR is not specific enough. Do you see that falling in that area?
I don't. No, I don't. I think again, it has to be a new significant impact, and just the volume or nature of comments doesn't necessarily dictate whether something's recirculated. So two comments can result in recirculation, and 1,000 comments could result in not recirculation. It depends on whether or not the public has been denied an opportunity to meaningfully comment on a significant adverse effect of the project.
Jim, how about if the significant adverse effect of the project is caused by the project changing?
Yeah, I mean, that's
the question that we're considering here, and I think it goes to one of your initial points was, how is CEQA used as a tool? And I think your point in a nutshell was it's not so much a policy driving tool. It's more once you have the policy in a near final stage, CEQA wants you to go out and determine what the environmental impacts of that policy decision would be, and then are there easier or more beneficial ways from the environmental perspective of going about accomplishing what you're trying to do.
Right.
So
I think it's important to distinguish between comments that you may have gotten on a draft EIR and what that means for recirculation, which is, I think, as I just described, which is very different from the project is now changed in some way that dictates going back to the public to review those potentially significant environmental effects of that changed project. And those are different. So I want to make sure I keep those separate. The comments on the EIR on the fifth staff draft from anything that may occur based on the sixth, the next draft that we'll find out here in in the next couple of days, and then towards the end of April as the staff deals with the direction.
Can I also respond maybe in a simpler way? My best estimate right now is that, yes, we will need to do recirculation, not as an attorney, but as the manager that has to deal with this, just so you get a straight answer.
Right.
My guess right now is, yes, it will be triggered.
That's what I was really asking.
But I think that would be based on the sixth draft, not necessarily.
It would be. And no decision's been made, and it will come to you before that's made with the legal analysis and everything. But I gathered you wanted to know, well, what do you really think is going to happen?
Right.
What I really think is going to happen is that there will be enough changes, enough restructuring in the draft plan based on the discussion in the next couple of days and the next month that in the end the attorneys will say, in order to make sure that people have the right opportunity to comment, we need to recirculate.
And it's also important to note that
What does it do to the time frame?
that CEQA doesn't require, CEQA gives you flexibility to recirculate all of the EIR or a portion of it. And, one idea that we have, Gwen, I'll give Gwen credit for this, came up with is to treat the next draft of the EIR next draft of the Delta plan as a new alternative and just do a short supplement or partially revised EIR that really just focuses on that, which would actually help focus the discussion for the public, would allow them not to have to resubmit comments that they already submitted, which will be helpful to everybody, and allow us to do it more quickly. So that's one thought brilliant thought that Gwen came up with.
And if I could just add a finer note to what Joe said, and hopefully I'll put it simply as well, even though Joe will hate me for saying this. The decision about recirculation hasn't been made yet, and it really all hinges upon, as Jim said, a couple criteria that are laid out in CEQA, but also what your decision ultimately is with respect to what you want to see in a sixth staff draft. If CEQA requires recirculation, that's one thing. If the board decides, irrespective of the legal technicalities, if because of transparency, the public process, it thinks that from a public policy perspective, recirculation is the way to go, that's another option. So I think that the finer point is we're not there yet, and no decision has been made, but it's obviously an issue. It's an issue that we flagged in our report to the legislature. We've talked about it, and so we will keep you apprised, and we will help you to make the best decision that you need to make.
I'm going to circle back to a point I made, and I cheated, but this is the table 3 of all the endless comments that are around, which Pat is going to distribute or not distribute to everyone. But I think you got to take a look at the categories. I'll just give you an illustration, and I haven't had a chance to review it because I just got it. I understand a category, a theme or recommendation that says land use planning must be clear and consistent across agencies. Now, I think I understand that anyway. I do not understand a theme or recommendation that says request for clarifications about the language in the fifth draft, which stated that although regulatory actions are exempt from the consistency determination requirements, the underlying action necessitating regulatory approval may be a covered action concerned about conflicting jurisdictions. It's how you organize the issues and how you describe the categories that either helps or hinders understanding. And this is not quite right, but I noticed that one of your categories is related to BDCP, where essentially all along everybody's come to us and first they either say that BDCP should be brought to a halt and start all over again, or anything that happens in BDCP is okay and you should just say that right now. Since we're not prepared to say either of those two things, we faced the recommendations from the Delta Protection Commission on the Economic Sustainability Plan, which we reviewed. And I can't remember, but I think there were 3 or 4 items out of the 38 done. I think it was 38 items that really depend upon BDCP concluding its action. So we have a proposal clearly stated that can be evaluated. And we said, essentially, our staff said those are premature. They're premature because BDCP is not completed. Now, I assume that that's the kind of thing you'll say in response to comments on some of these. I don't have any idea. But I think that if this is to inform our process, and I think in part it is, I think you have to think more carefully about how to describe the categories and then give us the numerical facts that exist, how many comments, kind of what Gwen did and you were doing on, more than 50% of the comments are just incorporated documents, or 50% or whatever from previous submissions. We need that to understand what's in here, if anything. Understanding that the final stuff is going to come to us. But inevitably, we're curious about what's going on.
We can be more precise with how many comments relate to these categories, and can produce that pretty quickly.
Yeah, I following up on Gwen's first memo, which is the very first, you did it 4 days after the deadline, I think it was. That just gave us a count, the names of submission. I'm sure there were a couple things that were missed, but there weren't many that were missed, and that was a very useful summary document. The procedural useful documents that try to group the categories of comments by category is a useful effort. These strike me as not clear categories. I mean, more clarity is needed about how the EIR handled different geographic areas of the state. I look at that and I say, oh, well, this is everyone said, we're exceeding our scope of authority. There's nothing we can do outside the statutory delta, if we can even do anything there. That's what it sounds like. It may not be, but that's what it sounds like to me. I do think it's important, though, to remember that the EIR is not the Delta plan, and the structure of it and comments on it are not necessarily the same type of comments, nor is our response and formulation of it the same as comments on the Delta plan. I'm aware of that, but undoubtedly you will say that some of the comments are not really environmental impact comments. They're comments about the plan itself. You've already said that. Okay. And putting those in one box might be appropriate. Be curious to know how many of them are comments about the Delta plan and not the environmental impact report. I mean, I understand it's easy for me to say it. It's not easy for you to conclusively determine it, but it's possible. That's the kind of stuff that for me that helps make this process more understandable and ultimately more publicly explainable, which is why I started with programmatic versus project EIR and the need to explain it. And another category in here is the stakeholders who are complaining that their submitted alternatives were either not fully analyzed. That's an EIR comment, I assume. But what they really mean is you didn't dutifully analyze everything we submitted in the way we wished you to analyze it. And of course, they were told in the beginning, it's a bookend. We're going to fit you within the bookend of the range. We are not saying we're doing 5 environmental impact reports or 7 or whatever in the Dickens they were. We're doing 1 environmental impact report. I mean, it's the public expectation which most of the advocates have, knowing better, knowing the limits of EIRs, but when you're in a battle that includes a plan and an EIR, you gum it all up and demand that both meet the same measure.
Well, one thing we can do that might be helpful is to separate out from the EIR comments all of those comments that we got that are comments on the Delta plan, and put those in the kind of language that may be helpful. Now, I'm guessing that probably 100%, close to 100%, are comments that you already are aware of through that chart that you're reading from, which I believe is all the comments on the Delta plan. I would venture a guess that we will not deliver to you more than maybe a couple of minor permutations on the comments you've already gotten. It's not going to be a whole wealth of, these are totally new, something or other we didn't know about for purposes of comment on the Delta plan, because largely they came from the same parties. So, but we can go through that exercise, which I think will be valuable for us, which I think Gwen's probably already done. She's saying 417 total comments out of the 3,865 were really straight Delta Plan comments, and that's probably really segregable Delta Plan comments, and there are lots of that overlap. So we could go through that exercise and produce that for the council to ensure that there's not something in there comment-wise that you have not even been presented with by staff. Would that be, and with some relative sense of how many people said that, would that be a helpful tool?
I mean, the answer is I think so. But
Okay.
I don't know so till I look at them. And it won't have a full reaction until I have a chance to review the Table 3, which we've not had a chance to review. But it's that approach that seems to me is useful to us. If it is not inconsistent with your legal obligations on doing an environmental impact report, I'd urge you to consider some of these things we're talking about.
Well, I think we can do that outside of the CEQA process, when we can take, because of the I think inherent somewhat conflating or overlap between the Delta Plan and the EIR itself, we can go through an exercise to extract out of the comments that were nominally labeled Delta Plan EIR comments and pull out of it a list or themes with some sense of how significant they were, where they were just purely Delta Plan comments. Because what we're going to say in the EIR in response to those is, this is a comment on the Delta Plan that doesn't raise environmental implications, period. I mean, that's what CEQA says you're supposed to do, which isn't very helpful or satisfying probably from your perspective. So I think we can do that, and that will be, go ahead.
Of the Delta Plan, what we categorized, and we just finished the the quality control on the delineations of the comments. And of those Delta Plan comments, we tried to be true to the commentor. If they said, the Delta Plan said, especially if they added a page number, what we still need to do, and it's the next subcategory of that, is some of those Delta Plan comments are on the specifics of what became the proposed project in the draft programmatic EIR. And so those would be, they'd be still Delta Plan comments, but they're also associated with the EIR. We also received a number of comments in the sense of saying, in Chapter 1 of the Delta Plan, and they would talk about a paragraph which is in the Delta Plan itself, which is not associated, except in a very general terms, that it's the same project, but it's not specific to the proposed project that was in the draft programmatic EIR. So we need to separate those out right now. I
think what Gwen's talking about is that we reviewed the project is the policies and recommendations, not the narrative. So to the extent that's what I think what she's talking about.
That's exactly right. Thank you. And so it's specific to the policies and recommendations in the proposed project, and so we need to separate those out. But we did have them separate in that point. We can easily do that. But of the 417, they include both.
Felicia?
Yeah, I don't envy you the task of putting this together. And I think I asked this question before, and I apologize if I don't remember the answer. I think doing a programmatic is just really, really hard. I'm trying to think. I think the last programmatic was an offshore oil drilling programmatic that I worked on a million years ago that was a NEPA one. Have you identified, nothing's this complex, but complex programmatic EIR that won one of those CEQA challenge cases that you could look at as sort of what you're aiming for in this?
Yeah, well, CalFed's one, and it's different than this. I mean, CalFed won, it went all the way to the Supreme Court and won, and so that's definitely been a guiding. But again, that actually had a list of specific projects that were being proposed largely for approval by the CalFed family. So this is, while that's guidance, and very good guidance because it's very similar in some respects in terms of at least substantive topic area, it's, we're in a less precise world than that was. So, but that's been guiding the scoping plan for the AB 32 and their cap and trade implementation has been another one. Although that was done under a CEQA equivalency process that was frankly far shorter in terms of its length than one we're doing here because it got some special dispensation, which one can look whether that would have been appropriate here, but we're not in that land. We're where we are. So
That's right. You said that.
yeah. So
Yeah,
we're in some uncharted territory. I think to some degree because it's of the incredibly high level nature of the plan, yet the incredibly broad substantive and geographic scope of it. I think it's that's why we had to invent some I think clever and useful tools like looking at these analogous projects from other EIRs to borrow from them because otherwise we would have produced something that was even more high level in general than we produced already. So I mean but we have I think CalFed's been a good tool in its level in its approach.
Right. Well, I'm thinking about I have a lot of confidence in your legal assessment of this as well. One of the questions I'm looking for, and I think some of the other questions are dealing with, I'm not sure that I need more paper on it. I think it's more, sorry. I think the question is this notion of how does this feed into helping us make the decision. So there's obviously we need to spend time on making sure our responses to comments are accurate, but also that we're incorporating the things that make sense to incorporate that we've learned from the process. And then as we look at the sixth draft, we'll need to see if the changes in the sixth draft or what you see as additional changes you can envision towards the seventh draft based on our reaction to the sixth draft. There'll need to be sort of a honed process of saying what did we learn from this EIR process and how should that shape how we look at it, which is your opening was great because we are doing an environmental impact report. We're not doing an overall planning analysis of alternatives, although that's a nice thing to do. Sometimes that's not what the law is actually requiring. So, for example, do you feel that in the storage and conveyance section, that if we add a much longer discussion of storage and conveyance, which is one of the things I've asked for as a bottom line, that you've covered it because you did have a recommendation in there about the California Water Commission finishing their studies, but do you feel that it would make a difference in how you reviewed it when we expand that? Because again, we'd still be expanding it at a programmatic level. You don't have to review temperance, flat, and sites and all of that in specificity in order to do it. But that I can envision that as being a place where you might have to recirculate if we do the kind of job on that chapter I think we ought to do on that chapter. But maybe I'm deferring to you because I just don't have as much closeness to programmatic CEQA cases because mine, when I was a CEQA lawyer, was all project. Well, I guess land use planning, but even that's more specific.
So I guess two responses to that. One would be, to give you the annoying the lawyer answer. Well, it depends on exactly what the chapter says. Right. If it's the narrative, if it's an expansion of the narrative for public informational purposes, but it's not a substantial change to the policies or recommendations associated with that, wouldn't necessarily trigger recirculation because it doesn't have any effect one way or the other in terms of nudging effect of the recommendations or regulatory effect of the policies. So, but if you change the policies and recommendations, then it very well could. But it also depends on the nature of the way that it's changed. If it expands what this council desires be done, either through its regulatory power or through its bully pulpit power, then we might have to recirculate or expand. We did look at the various reservoirs and borrowed from the EIRs, like on Los Vaqueros, it's already been done. So if you are just saying, we really want that to be done versus we kind of think it should be done, we've pretty much covered that one way or the other.
That's kind of what my question was.
Yeah, and then another reaction to what you said is that, if it's headed in the direction of recirculation, we are, working feverishly to get through the comments and get, at least a pretty solid internal drafts of responses by the end of April, so that to the extent that anything comes out of that review, analysis, and drafting that should inform the next draft, we'll have that, and either be part of the sixth or it would be part of something that would be included in the recirculated EIR that then would inform the 7th.
I think that's helpful. I mean, I actually have more experience doing EIRs than in suing EIRs. But my experience, it's been much easier to make a decision looking at comments and draft responses to comments. I mean, I think once you do the draft response to comment, you have a much clearer idea if you really got the comment. Because I found sometimes that people will have a literal reaction to the comment, but it's really not what the commenter intended. And what you've got to do is look to that intent if you really are owning that you want these comments to help you do a better plan. So
which is the purpose.
Yeah, that all sounds that sounds great, and time will tell. I'm happy to wait on that. One other question, and I might have this wrong, but isn't it CEQA that you do a statement of overriding concerns if you're going to do something that will have an environmental impact one way or the other?
Right.
At a certain threshold, are you considering needing to do that?
Absolutely, yeah. So at the end of the process,
that's so interesting.
yeah. So at the end of the process, this council will be asked to make CEQA findings, and it's CEQA findings about the alternatives, and you will evaluate each alternative for its ability to meet project objectives while feasibly lowering significantly adverse environmental impacts. So you will evaluate all the alternatives under those 3 criteria. You will also evaluate and impose on yourself this robust set of mitigation measures that the EIR contains, and you will also make findings about each significant adverse effect, whether it can be mitigated, and if not, you will do what's called a statement of overriding considerations. It says, notwithstanding the fact that we may have some negative environmental outcomes, it's okay for the following policy reasons, and that will be a bit of a tricky exercise for a reason that we've already stated to you, which is because this council doesn't have the ability to require mitigation measures for actions that you want to happen that aren't covered actions. We assume, because CEQA requires, that all local agencies will do what they're supposed to do and follow your mitigation measures, even if you don't have to. But CEQA sets up this situation where if we had said all of those will be taken care of because local agencies are going to do exactly what they're supposed to do, exactly as we would want them to do, even if we don't have power, that will be less than significant. We would have opened ourselves up to significant legal risk by saying, oh, you don't know that for certain. So we had to kind of go overbroad on the other side and say, well, there's all this bad stuff's going to happen only because we can't go down there. And so, it'll be an exercise that we'll have to be really careful to make sure that that legal reason for saying that some bad stuff may happen is couched in a way that distinguishes between, okay, this really might be a problem irrespective of good intentions by every local government, and these are just ones where I think we're pretty sure these are going to be okay. And we did, I think in the EIR, we did make an attempt to distinguish between, to really identify the stuff that, okay, this actually could be a potential problem, like nighttime construction. In some places, nighttime construction with water projects, you can't just sort of send everybody home while the water's pouring in. And, if you're doing a construction project on a levee, I mean, a lot of those I think you can't really stop. You got to have somebody there working, and you don't want to suspend at night, and that could have nighttime construction noise, and that's real. That could really happen. So we tried to identify the ones that were actually potentially problems and ones where it's probably not a problem, but for legal reasons we had to be safe.
It's a hard task. I'm sort of sorry we didn't, or maybe you tried, that we didn't just loop that Davis class into making them all help us as a turn project for this semester. We've had a bunch of extra help, but that's all of that.
Okay. Any other questions?
Do you,
Jim?
Do you want me to go through these themes or not?
I think not, unless council members want to go through the memo. The fact is we'll shortly get a copy of, if we haven't already, of this Table 3, which we need time to review.
Well, Mr. Chair, though, that table is on the Delta Plan comments. It's not from the EIR process.
So, and I want to add, the EIR comments are all posted, as I understand it.
Okay, well, if that's, then why are we getting it in the EIR discussion? Well, of course, we did it. We didn't. We got it in the Delta Plan discussion.
In the Delta
Plan. We're using it for whatever purposes we're using it.
Right.
Oh, I see.
I apologize because I just wanted to make that clarification that is not the EIR comments in that table.
Okay.
So just to conclude, then, we will endeavor to produce a similar list of themes that we already produced that we looked at briefly before, but we will pull that theme will be themes that came out of the Delta Plan EIR comments that are really Delta Plan comments, and produce that for you here as soon as we can.
Great. And my only suggestion is similar to something that Phil said, make it a little easier for you, even though you're giving us more flavor. You could condense some of these bullets so you had fewer bullets, and then you could have a little sub thing, because some of them are similar to each other, like this whole issue of vagueness or whatever, and that just keeps it simpler for you.
Sure. Okay. And I think last thing to reiterate, and this will come up later, is, again, it's the mitigation measures that really are where, for the most part, the CEQA rubber meets the road. And GP1, and you'll get this later, is being revised to require all covered actions to comply with all the mitigation measures from the EIR. So that is how CEQA is designed to work. You're supposed to amend your project to incorporate all the mitigation measures, and that's being done through GP1, which is in, I think, attachment 2 of your table that you'll get later on.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right.